All right. Well, let's begin. So we welcome you to Reputation 2024, the 27th edition. Reputation, created by Leger, is the only study that provides a comprehensive sectoral analysis of reputation for more than 302 companies across Canada, conducted among more than 38,000 Canadians using our Leger Leo panel. The collection took place, as it does each year, between mid-December of 2023 to the end of January. We remind you that there will be a question period at the end for this purpose. And for this purpose, we will ask you to use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. So let's begin. Why does reputation matter? Why are we at Leger so preoccupied with it? Well, we know that companies that have a better reputation attract more customers, including their attention and their spending. Customers are also more forgiving of these companies when they make mistakes. The inverse is also true. When companies have a weaker reputation, customers are looking to disassociate from them or look for alternatives. In some industries, we don't have a lot of choice. For example, grocery, telco, and banking, particularly in Canada. So you either choose from one of those limited competitors or you spend less. Specifically, having a good reputation builds trust with stakeholders, which can include customers, investors, and partners, gives you a competitive advantage, attracts more customers, better employees. We'll dig more into reputation as employer later on in the webinar, builds customer loyalty, positively affects your financial performance, stock prices, the bottom line, and it gives you resilience in a crisis or goodwill. We have definitely seen that play out over the years as companies have gotten into hot water and either quickly or not so quickly gotten out of it. For those of you who tuned into our webinar in January, you heard Dr. Alan Middleton discuss his new book, Why Reputation Matters, with our own Dave Schultz. This particular quote from the book resonated with me as I prepared for this webinar. While rare and minor issues may not have huge impacts on an organization's reputation and activities in the short term, failing to pay attention and develop policies and practices that reduce vulnerability is just poor management practice. This sentiment definitely encapsulates the ups and downs we have seen over the last 27 years of studying reputation. So, reputation each year is set against the backdrop of recent events and trends in Canada. News stories, economic realities, and this year is no different. 2023 in Canada saw layoffs, rising costs, shrinkflation, housing affordability issues, more climate change, and population growth attributed from the influx of newcomers to Canada. If you tuned into our webinar 2 weeks ago, you would have heard about the newcomer experience. But back to reputation. So behind many of these headlines is the government in its role in some of the daily tribulations Canadians are facing. As pollsters, we are always tracking voting intentions, and we track satisfaction with the government. As you can see, more than twice as many Canadians are dissatisfied than satisfied with Trudeau's government, and the divide continues to widen. 6 in 10 Canadians are angry about how the country is being managed by the federal government. Further to that, 7 in 10 Canadians feel that everything is broken in this country right now. Affordability, leadership, failing healthcare, and a sense of declining standard of living are some prominent reasons to think Canada is broken. The most important issues for Canadians are rising costs and inflation, the state of healthcare, housing affordability, and jobs in the economy. However, when asked what issues Canadians believe that the government and decision makers in the federal government are focused on most, 3 of the top 4 are not what we see here. Rising costs and inflation is perceived as only the second most important for government, where we can see it's by far the most important issue for Canadians. When people feel this disconnect with the government, that's when they look towards corporations. In the country's current backdrop and misalignment, it's even more important that companies align with values. Shanze will speak more on this topic later on in the webinar. So looking at the variation across all sectors this year, the story is really about general stability. The average variation across the board, across all companies, was 0. So not a huge story on big ups or downs. We had 12 sectors decline, 12 sectors increase, and 6 remain completely stable. So the swings themselves were very minimal, ranging from a +5 to a decrease of 4 for these sectors. But the stories we found were really in the individual companies themselves, and we're seeing bigger variations there. So similar to the previous slide, the decreases we observed this year aren't quite as extreme as last year. Last year, we saw a drop for Twitter of a -24. We did see some declines in the grocery and food sectors, with Kraft Heinz, McDonald's, Campbell's, and Burger King declining. Sobeys has been on a continual decline since 2020. And as you can see here, lost another 5 points this year. Again, Shanze is going to get into both the Weston story and the Sunwing story later on in the webinar. And with only 15% of Canadians over the age of 5 getting an updated COVID vaccine as of the beginning of December 2023, the Pfizer drop of 8 points and the Moderna drop of 6 points tells a real story of what have you done for me lately. While we haven't been tracking Moderna for as long, Pfizer rose 10 points in 2021 and again in 2022. So we're seeing a big increase there overall of 20 points, highlighting the goodwill they garnered through the pandemic. But not as many Canadians are out getting vaccines in the past year. And so Pfizer and Moderna have fallen off the radar a little bit. So for the good news story for 2024, we see a bit of a recovery for the telco sector, with Bell having an increase of 7 points, and not shown here, but still decent, is TELUS with an increase of 5 points. Rogers over-indexed with an increase of 14 points, showing that Canadians have started to forget about that outage they had in 2022, coupled with their Shaw deal closing last year. And while this may be Toronto-centric, which I get called out for quite a lot, they also made 5G available on the TTC, which may be contributing to their increase for those of us who are in Toronto and using that service. Bombardier and Boeing each increased 8 points. Amazon with an 8-point increase as well this year, and we're going to get into those increases in more detail shortly. Formerly SNC-Lavalin, the new rebranded AtkinsRéalis was the change that turned around their reputation score, combining the name of a previous acquisition from the UK, Atkins, with Realis, a word inspired by the city of Montreal and the company's French-Canadian roots, has proven to be the inflection point the company, and particularly their CEO, was hoping for. So now on for the ranking, the top 10 most admired companies. So it's always exciting for our team to dig into the top 10 each year after we receive the tabulated results. It's a reveal to us as well. We weren't surprised to see many of the same companies we are used to seeing. This sparked a curiosity to see how these top 10 companies have ranked over the last decade. On average, these companies have made it into the top 10 7 times, with 3 having made it into this top 10 every single year for the past decade. So coming in at number 10, we have Costco. Costco has been in our top 10 4 times over the past decade, and it is not only a brand that is known for delivering on value in this time of rising costs, it is also consistently one of our top employers in the ranking we're going to delve into next. Oh, sorry, number 9 is, sorry, I lost. 1 second. Lost my notes here. Number 9 is Dollarama. Also, we've seen Dollarama over the past 10 years jump in. Dollarama popped in in 2016 for the first time. With, I'm just lost my notes here. So Dollarama dropped in, and they've been in the top 10 several times as well. Number 8 is Amazon. They fell out of the top 10 for a few years and then came back into the top 10 last year, I believe. Microsoft at number 7 has been in the top 10 a few times as well over the past several years. Shoppers Drug Mart made it into the top spot twice over the course of the pandemic. YouTube, with its content generation, has made it into the top 5 spot this year. Samsung, a mainstay in our top 10 over the past several years, number 4 this year. Canadian Tire also rose to our top spot as number 1 during the pandemic, but is now number 3, a pretty solid showing there. Sony, again, one of those companies that is pretty consistently in our top 10. And then lastly, Google. Google's a real star, having been in our top 10 times in the past decade, and having this top spot 6 times in the past 10 years, which is really outstanding. And now I'm going to hand it over to Shanze, who's going to take us through the employer ranking.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Lisa. So before I actually show you the overall ranks for the employers, I'm going to explain the dimensions that feed into that employer reputation score. So we have 4 main dimensions that we look at. The first one is, how do people really feel about the working atmosphere? Is it seen as a good place to work? Number 2, the future of the company. How confident are people in the future? Do they believe that the company will still be thriving in the coming years? And then we see its attractiveness as an employer. Would individuals be eager to work there themselves? Would they recommend it to others if they're retired themselves and are no longer in the working population? And then number 4, we have a factor that weighs pretty heavily, especially among our younger generation, is whether the company's ethics and practices align with their personal values. So with that in mind, let's see who stands out as Canada's most reputable employers. So what you'll notice over here is a really clear pattern where the positive overall reputation correlates with your high employer rankings. So you'll see a big overlap with the companies that Lisa presented for Canadian companies overall, and then those that are perceived as top employers. So it's evident that being well regarded, it not only boosts, your overall public image, but it elevates your status as being, a sought after place for work. We have companies like Google, we have Costco, who excel in their own respective industries, but they're also setting the standard for what it takes to be an exceptional employer. You do see a lot of tech in this list. So we have Google, we have Apple, we have Microsoft, we have Sony, we have Samsung. So even despite, the layoffs that had been making the news, they still make it into our top 10. Now, a question that we get every year is, well, how do Canadian companies factor into this? And we saw in Lisa's list that 3 of the top 10 are in fact Canadian. So we had Canadian Tire, we had Shoppers, and we had Dollarama. So they were number 3, number 6, and number 9 respectively overall. But that is pretty impressive. So despite Canadian companies operating with comparatively limited access to capital and, in relatively smaller markets, especially when you compare it to, their counterparts in the US, and to global counterparts, because at the end of the day, that's who they're competing with. They're competing with global giants like Google, like Microsoft, and those names are honestly, they're universal. They're ubiquitous. Everyone admires them, and so it's a high bar that's been set. And yet, these 3 companies broke through those rankings and made it to the top 10. And if you look at the overall list, so these are our top 15 Canadian companies overall, and so they're number 3 to number 39 across Canada. One of the industries that's sort of standing out is retail. So whether you look at home hardware, Canadian Tire, Dollarama, or specialty retail like Winners, like Marks, they are being a little bit overrepresented in our top Canadian companies. And retail is followed by food and beverage. So you're probably noticing A&W, McCain, and of course Tim Hortons, Maple Leaf as well. But what is really tying all of these companies together? What makes them stand out? Of course, we do have some outliers. So, for example, we have an Interac, which isn't really in line with the rest of the industries that we've been talking about. But it does make sense because at the end of the day, this is one of the only ways for Canadians to transfer money, compared to the US, where this service is pretty fragmented. We have multiple players. So, of course, this would make it to the top. But one of the things that we notice is that some of these companies, they're not just Canadian, they're exclusively Canadian. So they have limited to no presence elsewhere. What is that leading to? That's leading to really strong brand recognition, a really strong identity. They're really household names with a long-standing history in Canada. And you'd be hard-pressed to drive more than 15 minutes and not run into one, or if not all of these brands. So really, there's just a part of our community. And then, of course, another thing that ties them together are some of their widely known ESG initiatives. So we have things like, Canadian Tire's Jumpstart, or we have Tim Hortons, I believe it's called Foundation Camps. And then we have Shoppers Drug Mart, which of course invests in women's health. So their initiatives are in fact directly related to their sector. So they're building this, synergy, and it's something that's really benefiting them. And we'll talk about this a little bit more towards the end as well. So I wanted to spotlight the champions that we have for each of the sectors in Canada that we study. And the first thing that should stand out for you, and that you might notice, especially if you have been tuning into our webinar year after year, is that this list barely changes. You're seeing the same names in the same sectors, and they're just dominating their industry. They know what they're doing. They're continuing to do it well. So it's really difficult to push them out. Of course, when you see some big changes, so for example, Campbell, they dropped their reputation score by 5 points this year. It left Kellogg's in a position to overtake them. They had zero change. They did not change their score at all, but they were able to become the sector leader because of Campbell's loss. Some of you who might be into with the latest news might be wondering how Kellogg's has made it to the top for their sector. Well, this was fielded in December. So that is before the CEO made a comment about, eating cereal for dinner to deal with inflation, which many interpreted as very out of touch. So it's yet to be seen how that's going to impact their results, whether it's going to bring this gain down, and whether that's going to be lasting or not till the end of next year, or rather till the end of this year. We also had Boeing, which overtook Airbus this year. And that's because, as Lisa mentioned, Boeing had, an 8-point increase. It's one of the largest increases we saw in our study this year. But I want to point out, they've had a really tumultuous path and reputation. And it's likely because of the 737 MAX and, their aircraft's long-standing issues. But in 2018 and 2019, after the crashes in Indonesia and in Ethiopia, we saw it reflected in our data. We saw the 2020 data show a 37-point decline in Boeing's score. And so there was like an immediate tanking of their reputation. And it went down to a score of -7. So it went into the negative. But since then, they've been slowly bringing that up each year. And in 2024, we're at a score of +24. However, of course, when crises happen, and this is fielded right before, it's like, well, it probably missed that because earlier in March, after the Alaska incident where the door just blew off, the CEO announced that he will be resigning at the end of this year. So he's following the footsteps of his predecessor, who also resigned after the 2018, the 2019 crash. But we're going to have to see how this impacts their reputation. Will they lose all of the headway that they have gained over the past few years? Will it go down into the negative? So that is yet to be seen in next year's edition. Now, what I'm going to do next is spotlight some of the most interesting stories that we pulled out of this year's reputation study, because we saw a few sort of trends that emerged. And the first one is about Amazon. So what you're seeing over here is not their score, just as a note, it is their ranking out of their overall companies that we test each year, so over 300 plus companies. And what you see is a pre-pandemic, we saw it start to move up. And it actually made it into our top 10 in 2019. It started to slip in 2020, but it had honestly a steep nosedive in 2021 and in 2022 during the pandemic. So they were number 43 and 42. It's likely due to the push for people to, buy local and support small businesses during COVID, and we saw that, become a very important factor for consumers at that time. But over the last 2 years, we are seeing Amazon climb back. So it's making a pretty solid recovery. It is number 8 again now in 2024. I think what this is at the end of the day related to is their huge investment into Canada. So since 2010, Amazon has invested $40 billion in its Canadian operations. That includes infrastructure, that includes compensation to employees. And of that 40 billion, 12 billion, for example, was just in 2022. They estimate to have actually indirectly supported more than 87,000 jobs in 2022, and that's in areas of construction and logistics and so on. So they are really a major player in our market right now. And honestly, even in our lives, whether we think about their Amazon Prime deliveries or even their streaming content, I think they're really just on the path for growth in Canada. As Lisa alluded to earlier as well, with the decline of Sunwing, we wanted to look at the overall airline sector on most of the major airlines that we measure, and we see declines across the board, with the exception of Porter this year. And there are a couple of reasons that this could be happening. So during the pandemic, obviously the industry faced unprecedented shutdowns, airlines downsized staff, they idled planes in an effort to minimize their losses. But now that travel has sort of picked up, or completely opened up rather, there remains a shortage of planes, there remains a shortage of staff, and we're unable to accommodate this increased demand. We all know the massive delays that happened, the lost baggage, the misplaced baggage, all of this just became the norm, and it led to just a generally poor flying experience. In 2023, there was actually a complaints backlog at the Canadian Transportation Agency with 57,000 cases, and that's triple that of the year before. So, and most of these tickets were around compensation claims for flight delays or for cancellations. And we saw that reflected in our data last year. We showed how airports took a really big hit. But this year, they are showing potential for recovery. So for example, Pearson, which went down a full 45 points last year, has recovered by 17 points this year. If anyone's wondering why with such big declines or increases, these aren't mentioned in our largest increases or decreases, that's because these are not national brands. So they're not included in the overall ranking. So they're only asked in a certain region. And what we also see is that, we have global instability, which is sort of leading to fuel costs, a higher fuel cost, which is pushing airline prices high. So StatsCan actually reported last year that there was a 19% year-over-year decrease in airline prices in 2023. But what you really need to keep in mind is if comparing it to 2019, so comparing it to pre-pandemic levels. And when you do that, it is actually still 4.6% higher relative to 2019. So consumers still see this as too expensive, especially at a time when we are really trying to cut discretionary spending. And so airlines or travel just seems too expensive or too out of bounds right now, especially paired with the poor customer experience that we're facing. So while that demand for travel has returned, the cumulative effect of all of these factors, it's led to a reputational hit in what's right now a pretty turbulent industry. And I think the biggest driver for this, in this case at least, is customer experience. But we have the Canadian Transportation Agency working on new air passenger protection regulations, and the aim is to strengthen protection to streamline the process for complaints and to ensure compensation for all flight disruptions. So we'll see how this impacts public perceptions going forward once this comes into effect, or the amendments come into effect, rather. Now, Loblaw has been in the news a lot. It hasn't been, for the best reasons. So what I wanted to highlight with this was a halo effect, but in a sort of negative way. We often hear about that in a positive light, how a company's strong reputation can lead to a positive influence on anything that's associated with the company. So if they launch a new product, if they have a related brand, the positive reputation can sort of carry over. But what we need to keep in mind is that the inverse is also true. When a company's reputation suffers, it will drag down, or can drag down, everything in its periphery. And that's what we're seeing is happening here. So there's a lot of growing discontent among grocery customers in Canada. They're really frustrated with the rising prices of groceries. And in most instances, you see that, a positive reputation leads to higher earnings. What you're seeing over here, if you look at this green line, is that it's the opposite. It's higher earnings are leading to, a decline in reputation. And that's because it's growing during an inflationary and, in fact, borderline recessionary period. So it feels that there's a little, that the prices are being hiked way too high, and that they're making money off of consumers' discontent. But we have sort of an oligopoly here when it comes to major grocers in Canada. So we don't see that resulting decline in revenue yet, because customers simply just don't have the alternatives to just switch to. Shoppers, on the other hand, has been relatively insulated from this decline. It's not nearly as sharp. It is declining. So 78, score of 78 in 2020, down to a score of 69 in 2023, or in December 2023, which means this year's score. So it's going to be an important one to keep an eye on. It's a different industry, so it's probably not being dragged down, the same extent. It's still in our top 10, but it's one that needs to be monitored, because at the end of the day, like, if you have been seeing social media, there are actually calls for the boycott of Loblaw. I was discussing this with a colleague earlier. There are subreddits, Loblaw is getting out of control, that have over 40,000 members. So they really need to keep this in mind, and they need to keep a pulse on their reputation before this gets out of hand, because we have seen boycotts do work. They are working. They are dragging down brands such as, for example, Bud Light in the US. And so it's just something that they're going to need to measure continuously and sort of get ahead of. I think one of the avenues that they might have to turn this around is their PC Optimum program. So they use that to communicate their value. And I think that might be a good avenue for engagement, and especially combined with their new CEO coming in, I think there is potential to turn things around. But we'll see. I won't make any predictions yet. Now, Netflix is a story we touched on last year. If you saw, this is where we left it. We saw that in December 2021, Netflix had a score of 69. Fell to 60, and then it fell to 38 in March of 2023. And that was obviously over the course of the few months where they were exploring the possibility of advertising. They were limiting password sharing. It hadn't fully come into effect, but it was on the horizon. And I think, in fact, password sharing might have started to be implemented by this point. But subscribers were really quick to react, and their reputation suffered heavily. But this is a brand that has a completely dramatic turnaround. Their score has rebounded significantly. It's to 58. It's almost at its score in December 2022. And our hypothesis is the Canadians held Netflix to a really high standard. We see that because with that score of 69, they were actually in the top 10 in Canada. They were responsible for producing innovative content and simultaneously challenging the film industry. So it honestly seemed like they could do no wrong. But when they started making business decisions that were seen as just business decisions, that were not really seen as being in the interest of the consumer, they were quickly penalized. But they did benefit from their previously positive reputation, because they quickly got Canadians to forgive and forget. And I think one of the biggest reasons for that is at the end of the day, the main gripe with Netflix was around password sharing. It wasn't a corruption charge. It wasn't price gouging. It wasn't a scandal. It wasn't a purely unethical stance. So the reaction was more short-lived. And I think it's a testament to the importance of repeated check-ins on reputation, especially during times of crisis, because you need to better understand whether an issue that you're facing is that going to be sticky. Is it going to drag you down for the coming years, or is this a temporary blip? And based on that, you would have to devise your communication strategy to appropriately manage the response. And I think that's what Netflix has done. To add to that, I don't even think that their subscriptions suffered very much from that password sharing. So we see that even in their subscription and their revenue and all of that. So what I wanted to show next is a pretty interesting case study of seemingly similar actions leading to completely opposing impacts on reputation. So in 2022, Twitter was bought by Elon Musk. And we saw, a lot of concerns around the sanctity of free speech on the platform, combined with pretty extensive and very public layoffs. So it really plunged their reputation from 12 to minus 12. And we alluded to this last year. And in 2023, perhaps in an effort to shed their negative image, Elon Musk decided on a complete rebranding of the platform. So they changed their name from Twitter to X. Customers seem to feel that this move was not only unnecessary, but perhaps a bit on the nose, and the resulting reputation score speaks volumes. So instead of going up or even staying stable, it's gone down further, minus 5 points. And so it's nowhere near where it used to be in December 2021. On the flip side, we had SNC-Lavalin, and Lisa already mentioned this. They're an example of a company that followed that same, name-changing protocol, but it actually resulted in a really impressive turnaround. So their score bounced from minus 24 and minus 19 to a positive 2 as the newly minted Atkins Realis. And as Lisa mentioned, their CEO wanted this to be an inflection point in his words, and that's really what it seems to be in this case. Now, one of the last things that I would like to turn your attention to before we end this webinar is the importance of ESG initiatives. So this year, we took a deeper dive into really understand what are the specific initiatives that are most important for each sector. So what we did was we asked respondents to prioritize in order of importance where companies in various sectors should direct their investments to excel as corporate citizens. Those were the words that we used. So what this slide represents are the top priorities, so #1 ranked ESG initiatives for each sector. So this really shows where consumers believe that companies should focus their investment efforts. The message is very clear and it's very simple. Invest in what is relevant to you. So while ESG initiatives are undeniably important across the board, the level of investment that consumers expect, it really depends on your industry. It depends on how pressing the issue is for the sector that you're operating in. So, for example, we have sectors that have been criticized for a lack of diversity. So in entertainment or media or culturally influential industries like books and bookstores and music and craft, that is where consumers want to see more substantial investment in DEI. So it's really about not just about putting your money where your mouth is, but about ensuring that you don't come across as performative, that you integrate your initiatives within your business model. Now, or invest where you actually have influence to change things. Now, for example, pharmaceutical companies, the #1 area where they should invest in is investing to fight major diseases. Same thing for drugstores. So it's an area that is relevant to them. And perhaps investing in mental health or investing in education is really just not going to give them the same benefit because it doesn't seem true to what their company really stands for and the area that people feel they should operate in. It just needs to not be seen as a generic set of values. It's still very important. So, for example, we see that there's a huge emphasis on reducing your carbon footprint. You see nearly all the sectors actually fall under this segment. And the reason is that it was actually chosen as number one for all of these sectors. So it's not just an option, I think. I think it's sort of seen as like a fundamental expectation. It's something that with all the natural disasters, the wildfires last year, it's just really top of mind. And this is something that all industries need to be investing in. If obviously you look at certain things like energy or automobile or transport, they will over index even more on the importance of reducing the carbon footprint, but it is still very important for the rest as well. But really, at the end of the day, I think the message is loud and clear. You need to have authentic and meaningful actions behind your initiatives. You need to think through and not come across as just checking off the boxes, and you need to commit to what you were saying. So I'm going to turn this over to Lisa to just sort of end on next steps.
Yes, thank you, Shanze. So as we do every year, we share a booklet, including the full rankings and some other study information by email. You'll also receive a recording of the webinar. So that's going to come a little bit later today. We're just finalizing those details and you'll receive that email. And next slide. If you want to purchase our study, so this syndicated piece, which includes a lot more information than we're obviously sharing here today, including the deep dive on the 6 recognized pillars of corporate reputation. The cost for that is $15,500. If you want to delve even deeper, we have another option, which is the full diagnostic study. Our syndicated study, we spoke to 38,000 Canadians, as I mentioned earlier. We have 302 companies. We give you your sector analysis, the full. It's a really inclusive report of a lot of information that you receive for that syndicated study. And then I think I'm going to go to questions. And since Shanze was just finishing up speaking, I can answer the first few questions because I've had time to prepare while she's been finishing. So our first question was from an anonymous attendee. Were FIs included in your study, and could you share rankings for the Canadian banks and credit unions? So in that sector, the top 3 were actually Interact, which Shanze mentioned as the sector leader, which the Canadian ranking it received was 12, followed by Visa at the ranking of 19, and then MasterCard at 29. Then we start to see some of the top 5 banks. TD is the top of the top 5 with the ranking of 74, so pretty far down our ranking. Then PayPal jumps in there to upset the stream of the big 5, followed by RBC at a rank of 90, BMO at 91, so close there, and CIBC close again at 94, not far behind is Scotia. In terms of the credit unions, so our study that with the list that we release includes corporations that operate across Canada, so fully across Canada. So you have to have a presence in each of our provinces, and that's where the credit unions are sort of less likely to be included. We do have some of the big ones like Farm Credit Canada in there, but of course, like our model works for any sector, and we also can run it with credit unions in a specific geographic region that they operate, and it still works. We can definitely do that as needed. So the next question, also from an anonymous attendee, I'll assume it is a different anonymous attendee. To what do you attribute the NHL's reputation as a top employer, considering how few people in Canada are employed by them? So our employer reputation is overlaid by actual reputation, which the NHL saw as the other sport leagues an increase this year. It's also sort of aspirational. Like, what do you consider? Would you consider them to be a good employee? I think there are a lot of Canadians who would love to be an NHL player and definitely employed by the NHL. So that keys into it as well. So I could see that as playing into why that made the top list. So it's not based on employees of these corporations, it's based on your perception of them as an employer. So we've like Costco, for example, we see them in the news all the time as being a great employer, great benefits. Over and over again, they really try to give back to their employees. And even though, very few of us on across Canada work there, we hear those stories. So it's about perceptions. Another question. Are there any Canadian business to business brands that stood out? So a few that stood out for me this year, of course, Atkins Realis, like we both talked about. Also, CN and CP Railways. They both went down by 9 points, and those are more, I would say, business to business brands. Shanze, do you have any others that you can think of that really stood out to you this year?
No, I think, but we do have a separate category that looks at that, so that's something we can get back to you on, and see who the top brands were for that category.
Yeah, and again, like similar to what I said about employer, like it really is perception. So even if you have no day-to-day dealings with for yourself, it's what people hear, it's what people read, it's what's in the media, what's out there. A question from one of our teammates, Kathleen. It's interesting to note that the top 10 companies are not necessarily reflected when it comes to the top 10 employers. So I wonder how much impact on reputation being a good employer has on people's opinions. And do you see it being a more important criteria as younger Canadians start ranking companies? Well, we of course include the younger age demographic. I'm not sure if it'll actually impact or it'll change the nature too much. Being a good employer has always been one of the components of having a good reputation. We've definitely seen Tim Hortons go into crisis over the way they were treating their employees a few years ago, when the minimum wage went up. So it certainly can negatively impact your reputation. I would say, like, unless you do something really outrageously good for your employees, you're probably not going to see it increase a reputation as much. But definitely, if you're not treating employees well, it will affect your reputation in a negative way. Do you have anything to add to that, Shanze?
I think, and part of her question was related to younger Canadians, and seeing that as more important. And I think even our youth study did highlight that whether a company aligns with your values is a very big driver for that generation, in terms of how they rank it, either whether as an employer or even as a corporation overall. So I do think it is more important to that generation, but it is still feeding into the scores that we see across the older generations as well.
And then question, I'll throw this back to Shanze as well. I didn't see, this is from Michelle Ferrand. I didn't see any FI insurance companies aligned to any of the ESG opportunities. Was there anything that stood out for these businesses? So where did they fall in that bucket?
Investing in education.
Oh,
So
that's right.
yeah, so banking and credit unions both fell into the number one opportunity for them that was highlighted, was investing in education, and I think that makes sense. It's seen as more in line with what they do within their sector, versus the rest of the options. But it's not necessarily what we see happening right now, where their initiatives are focused right now. So there is probably a bit of a disconnect.
So the next question from an anonymous attendee, were retailers also included as part of this study? And were there any specific types of retailers that were included, apparel, footwear? We do include some of the bigger corporations, some of the bigger box stores like the Walmarts, Costco's. In terms of apparel, footwear, we don't really get into those specifically. Those are really more part of our WOW study, which we release in the fall, I believe. And that's where that sort of comes in. And we look at the experience of shopping in those retailers more in that study than in the corporate reputation study. Somebody else and another attendee asked, what is the ranking of healthcare companies in Canada? So I'm assuming you mean pharmaceutical companies. So again, pharmaceutical companies before COVID really weren't on many Canadians' radars. A lot of people didn't know the names of or couldn't name many pharmaceutical companies. So we didn't see that come up too much. Pfizer, Moderna, the pandemic put these names in our regular lexicon. So we started to see them pop up in reputation. But as I mentioned, they also fell a bit this year as well. But yeah, we do have a full list of all the pharmaceutical companies, which their reputation scores tend to suffer from a lack of awareness overall. So they're usually hovering pretty close to zero, other than some of the bigger names like Bayer, Jameson. They are usually our top pharmaceutical companies each year. So do you see the Loblaw effect across the grocery category, Sobeys, Metro, Costco, Walmart, or is this something unique to Loblaws? Shanze, do you want to speak to that?
Sure. It is somewhat unique to Loblaw. It is more pronounced with Loblaw, and the fact that it's affecting Weston or it's affecting shoppers, and just how steep that decline is for sure unique to Loblaw. But we do see a decline in Sobeys as well. I can't recall off the top of my head exactly by how many points they fell, but I know that Sobeys fell as well. With Costco, with Metro, focusing on Costco and Walmart specifically, I think they're seen as better value grocers or retailers, however you'd like to classify them. So they are not seeing that decline to that extent. I think they have a value proposition that speaks to Canadians during this, I guess, inflationary times. And I think that it's something that they're seeking out from all of the brands that they have evaluated. And we see that in terms of the higher value, like the Dollaramas, the Costco's, all making it to our top 10 versus things like a Sobeys, like a Metro, which do not make it to our top rankings at all. So yes, I think it I guess depends on the value proposition.
Okay. That response. So outside of Jameson as the top pharmaceutical company, what other pharma companies stood out? So the pharmaceutical question is popular today. So the top ones following Jameson, like I said, were Bayer, then Pfizer, Moderna, then Merck, AstraZeneca, GlaxoSmithKline, Bristol Myers Squibb, Abbott, then Roche, and then there's a whole bunch that, like, the list is quite long in that category. And the average reputation score in this group is 10, which is fairly low. Like I said, generally skewed by a low awareness. Just trying to see. So there's been a few comments about the SNC-Lavalin Atkins Realis name change versus Twitter. Yeah, two totally different scenarios, but definitely interesting case studies to look at. Somebody here said SNC-Lavalin had no choice but to change, but the change worked for them. Twitter had lots of choices not to change and did change, and it negatively impacted their reputation. The other one, Shanze, you and I talked about it. I think Eric and Christian mentioned it in their webinar this morning. The La Capitale, in more of a Quebec-based insurance company changed their name to, is it Beniva? I'm not sure how to pronounce it.
Yes, I believe it's Beniva. And I think they saw an increase as well of 8 points.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, they did. So the La Capital, or SSQ, was the other name they were known by. That change also helped their reputation. So the Twitter one, I mean, the name change was might have been the final nail in the coffin for Twitter. I think they were on the downward spiral after their Elon Musk acquired them. But yeah, and changing the name did not help. Just looking to see, is there any other questions you see here, Shanze, that we need to answer?
There's one last question on, are there any specific actions you can attribute across any sector that have the most dramatic positive impact on reputation increase? So in our diagnostic studies that Lisa mentioned, that is actually what we do. We measure the drivers of reputation. We run an advanced analytics on those drivers to understand what is the top most important factor. But I think the biggest thing that we have learned over the years is that they're specific to each sector. While there may be a lot of commonalities between the companies within a sector, it's really different if you look at, for example, a pharmaceutical company versus a grocer or a retailer or anything like that. For example, we've seen again and again in some of the studies that we've done that ESG initiatives or CSR initiatives don't actually make it to the top most important factors for pharmaceuticals. There you want to see, investments in health, whether they're improving things related to, global access or health equity. Whereas for something like a retailer, those ESG initiatives are in fact more important. So unfortunately, can't give you one factor or like one size fits all answer. But it is something that we dive a lot deeper into in our diagnostic studies.
All right, I think that answers all of it. Any last words, Shanze? We're like 3 minutes away from the top of the hour or the bottom of the hour. I never really know what the right term there is. We'd like to thank everyone for coming and joining our webinar today. We really appreciate everyone's interest year after year. It's great sharing these results. You will, like I mentioned, get the booklet later this afternoon with our ranking. And if you want to hear more about your company or your sector, please reach out, solutions@leger360.com, or to Shanze or myself or anyone else at Leger. Have a great rest of your day. Bye, everyone.